filming this event.
Okay, we are live.
Hello, everyone. This is a greeting in my native language. We are welcoming you to the space. We'll give it another minute for people to enter this Zoom room, and we'll begin. And thank you again for coming. All right. People are coming in. We're already at 109. This is a great number. We're getting ready. We're still letting people in. And we'll begin shortly. All right. All right. Thank you so much for coming to this webinar on Indigenous self-determination. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Just very brief housekeeping details. This webinar is being recorded. We will be sending the recording to the people who have registered. It's also available on social media accounts, SIRGE Cultural Survival social media accounts. Please, if you have questions, put them in the chat. Also, if you would like to introduce yourselves, put your names, your location, or people you belong in the chat. We have interpretation available for you. It's in Spanish and Russian. The main conversation will be in English and Spanish. And it's available at the bottom of the screen. So there's a tab called Interpretation. If you don't see it, just click on More, and there will be an option to choose interpretation to the language that you prefer. So that's it for the housekeeping details. So today we will be talking about the fundamental right of Indigenous peoples to self-determination. We'll try to unpack that. It holds profound significance for Indigenous peoples all over the world. For Indigenous peoples, self-determination is the collective North Star and a cornerstone principle of Indigenous peoples' rights. Expressions of Indigenous peoples' self-determination are manifold. Article 3 of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples states, Indigenous peoples have the right to self-determination. By virtue of that right, they freely determine their political status and freely pursue their economic, social, and cultural development. Self-determination encompasses Indigenous peoples' right to determine their political status, establish governance structures, and define their engagement protocols with nation states and external entities. It includes the right to protect and promote cultural traditions, spiritual practices, and sacred sites, as well as to preserve traditional knowledge and ecological wisdom. Moreover, it is their right to maintain a connection to and stewardship of their environments, animal and plant life, and life-sustaining resources. Pertinent to energy transition that we're currently undergoing, or the so-called green economy, upholding the right both honors Indigenous people's sovereignty and self-governance, and is a fundamental requirement to achieving a just energy transition and sustainable economic development. For example, in the development of renewable energy projects on Indigenous territories, respecting Indigenous people's rights to self-determination ensures that projects align with their values and priorities, establishing genuine partnerships with sustainable outcomes. From renewable energy production to mining for minerals used in batteries to technology and end user product supply chain, all facets of the green economy require the recognition, understanding, and safeguarding of Indigenous rights to self-determination. So we're here today to learn from our leaders, from the trailblazers of the Indigenous peoples movement, who have been on the front lines of defining what self-determination really means for Indigenous peoples. I'm absolutely honored and humbled to be in presence of this important spokespeople, our leaders, our elders of the movement. So today we have Carlos Mamani, professor at the Universidad Mayor de San Andrés in La Paz, and steering committee member of the SIRGE Coalition. He was the chair and the member of the UN Permanent Forum from 2008 to 2010. Carlos wrote an article about Indigenous peoples' self-determination for cultural survival. It's available on Cultural Survival's website. Carlos also became known during the 90s for his work promoting the ILU system of governance in Bolivia, an indigenous land management method that existed in the pre-Inca era. Our next speaker, Les Malezer, is the chairperson of Foundation for Aboriginal and Islander Research Action. He has played a pivotal role with Indigenous peoples representatives from around the world in the historic adoption of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples by the UN General Assembly in 2007. Dalee Sambo Dorough is our next speaker. She is the associate professor at the University of Alaska in Anchorage. Dalee specializes in Alaska Native self-determination and has been directly involved in the discussion and negotiations of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Elsa Stamatopoulou is the director of Indigenous Peoples' Rights Program at the Institute for the Study of Human Rights, Columbia University. She became the first chief of the Secretariat of the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues in 2003. Elsa co-chairs the International Commission on the Chittagong Hill Tracts and is on the board of International Working Group on Indigenous Affairs, or IFGIA for short. So today I have overarching questions for all of our speakers. So the questions are, what does self-determination encompass for you and your community? And how have you seen self-determination manifest in your communities? What have challenges been historically and in contemporary contexts, such as the climate crisis or the so-called green economic development? Thank you so much. So I am going to give the first floor to Don Carlos Mamani. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Galina. Buenos días a todos y todas. Mis agradecimientos a Coalición SIRGE por la oportunidad de compartir el punto de vista de los pueblos originarios de la Via Yala sobre un tema tan fundamental para nuestra existencia colectiva como es el derecho a la libre determinación. Aprovecho también en saludar a Les Malezer, a Dalee Sambo, a Elsa Stamatopoulou, con la que trabajé en el tiempo que me tocó ser miembro y presidente del foro permanente, así que sus enseñanzas han sido muy importantes para mi trabajo. Y finalmente agradecer a nuestra anfitriona Galina Angarova. Para comenzar con mi participación, considero importante hacer un deslinde conceptual sobre quién es el sujeto del derecho a la libre determinación. Por supuesto que somos los pueblos indígenas, pero sin embargo quisiera referirme a la definición del relator José Martínez Cobo, que me parece lo más actual respecto de nuestros derechos. Son comunidades, pueblos y naciones indígenas, dice él, los que teniendo una continuidad histórica con las sociedades anteriores a la invasión y precolonial. Entonces aquí se reconoce que nosotros antes de la llegada del colonizador europeo, pues teníamos el goce de nuestro derecho a la libre determinación. Prosigue José Martínez Cobo. Constituyen ahora sectores no dominantes de la sociedad y tienen la determinación de preservar, desarrollar y transmitir a futuras generaciones sus territorios ancestrales y sus identidades étnicas como base de su existencia continuada como pueblo. Los sujetos, entonces, del derecho a la determinación, ante todo somos pueblos, porque aquí tenemos un gran problema con los terceros o las empresas transnacionales en que se confunde en el momento de aplicar este derecho, por ejemplo, el derecho a la consulta a la consulta para el consentimiento libre, previo e informado, de que las consultas deben ser hechas a las comunidades y no a los pueblos. En segundo lugar, reiterar, como reconocen la Declaración de las Naciones Unidas sobre los Derechos de los Pueblos Indígenas y la Declaración Americana sobre los Derechos de los Pueblos Indígenas también, el hecho de que los pueblos indígenas han sufrido injusticias históricas como resultado, entre otras cosas, de la colonización y de haber sido desposeídos de sus tierras. En este caso, es la Organización de Estados Americanos y las Naciones Unidas que están reconociendo nuestros derechos en razón de haber sufrido las injusticias históricas como resultado básicamente de la colonización. Por tanto, la relación histórica del movimiento indio o indígena con el proceso de descolonización que conllevó a nuestros mayores la lucha por la visibilización, el reconocimiento del flagelo del racismo y la exclusión. Impulsó también la lucha por el reconocimiento de los derechos expresados en la reforma del Convenio 107, la adopción del Convenio 169 de la OIT y la adopción de la Declaración de Naciones Unidas el año 2007. En ese contexto descolonizador, el artículo 3 de la Declaración es muy claro cuando señala: los pueblos indígenas tienen derecho a la libre determinación. Es la misma redacción que tienen los artículos primero de los pactos internacionales de derechos económicos, sociales y culturales y el Pacto Internacional de Derechos Civiles y Políticos. Para una comprensión de qué significa el derecho a la libre determinación en cuanto a los recursos naturales y territorios, tenemos el artículo 2 de los mismos pactos que señala: para el logro de sus fines, todos los pueblos pueden disponer libremente de sus riquezas y recursos naturales. Más abajo señala: en ningún caso podrá privarse a un pueblo de sus propios medios de subsistencia. Este mismo espíritu ha sido recogido en los artículos 4 de la Declaración de Naciones Unidas y el artículo 24 de la Declaración Americana de Derechos de los Pueblos Indígenas. Para reforzar el derecho establecido en los artículos 2 de los pactos internacionales, así como los artículos mencionados por la Declaración de Naciones Unidas y la Declaración Americana, acudo al estudio del relator especial sobre el derecho a la libre determinación, Héctor Grossespiel, quien establece el carácter múltiple e integral del derecho a la libre determinación. Porque sucede que en mi región, en mi país especialmente, se confunde el derecho a la libre determinación con la autonomía como un hecho político y administrativo. Entonces dice Grossespiel que la libre determinación incluye aspectos políticos, económicos, sociales y culturales. Su plena efectividad supone la existencia real de todos ellos. Es muy enfático Grossespiel al señalar que también incluye los aspectos políticos. Asimismo, el relator Grossespiel reitera sobre quién es el sujeto de la libre determinación. Señala él, es un derecho de pueblos, es decir, de un tipo específico de comunidad humana, unida por la conciencia y la voluntad de constituir una unidad capaz de actuar en función de un futuro común. Los pueblos, en cuanto tales, son los titulares del derecho a la libre determinación. Es más, señala que la efectividad del derecho a la libre determinación de los pueblos es condición o prerequisito ineludible para que puedan existir realmente otros derechos, como son los derechos humanos y las libertades fundamentales. Hoy, ante el desafío de que la transición pueda ser efectivamente justa para nuestros pueblos, en cuyos territorios se encuentran los minerales de transición, considero muy importante plantear la pertinencia del principio de la soberanía permanente de los pueblos y naciones sobre los recursos naturales, que fue gestado en las resoluciones 626 de 1952, la 1803 del año 1962, la resolución 2158 del año 1966, también la 2692 de 1970, por resolución 1314 del 12 de diciembre de 1953, la Asamblea General de Naciones Unidas estableció una comisión de la soberanía permanente sobre los recursos naturales y le dio instrucciones para realizar un estudio completo de la trascendencia de la soberanía permanente sobre los recursos y las riquezas naturales como elemento básico del derecho a la libre determinación. El principio es el siguiente. Cito, los pueblos y naciones deben disponer de autoridad para gestionar y controlar sus recursos naturales y disfrutar de este modo de los beneficios de su explotación y conservación. Es muy importante lo señalado en este principio porque no dice estados o estado-nación. Los sujetos son los pueblos y naciones. Fue así que el año 2001, cuando aún se redactaba la Declaración de las Naciones Unidas sobre los Derechos de los Pueblos Indígenas, Erika Daes planteó el principio de soberanía permanente de los pueblos indígenas sobre sus recursos naturales para corregir y combatir la conculcación de la soberanía económica de los pueblos indígenas. Sostuvo la señora Daes, el principio fue y sigue siendo una condición esencial para la materialización del derecho de libre determinación de los pueblos, y su derecho al desarrollo jamás será posible. Una autodeterminación política y económica significativa de los pueblos, si estos carecen de autoridad legal para ejercer el control de sus tierras y territorios. El estudio se explaya en las diversas prácticas de soberanía de los pueblos indígenas en las Américas, en los Estados Unidos, en el Canadá y en América Latina. En esa perspectiva, ciertamente, que el Estado plurinacional en mi región, hay dos estados que se han proclamado estados nacionales, el Ecuador y Bolivia, y también Chile estuvo en ese camino. Entonces, el Estado plurinacional reconoce la libre determinación de los pueblos indígenas, su autogobierno, tiene un marco constitucional de indudables avances. Sin embargo, en mi país, en Bolivia, de donde soy, el gobierno ha violado sistemáticamente los derechos de los pueblos indígenas a través del control de las organizaciones de los pueblos indígenas y negando o tergiversando el consentimiento libre, previo, informado. En América Latina, la totalidad de los países adoptó la Declaración de Naciones Unidas y la mayoría tiene ratificado el convenio 169 de la OIT, menos 3, que son Belice, Panamá y las 3 Guyanas. Deberíamos suponer que todos esos estados, cumplen con el artículo 15 del convenio 169. Sin embargo, ese no es el caso. Los estados incumplen con los compromisos asumidos y resultado de ello tenemos conflictos por disputas sobre territorios y recursos entre pueblos, empresas, minería informal que operan con apoyo estatal. En Bolivia, la extracción de litio y de otros minerales de transición no tiene participación de los pueblos indígenas. Las comunidades afectadas no fueron consultadas. Los contratos que realiza el Estado boliviano con las empresas transnacionales tienen el desconocimiento absoluto de los pueblos indígenas. Sin embargo, así como Madame Daes encontró prácticas de libre determinación en mi país, en mi pueblo, en el antiguo Collasuyo, tenemos autogobierno, tenemos en lo posible el control de nuestro territorio, así también de los recursos naturales. Porque incluso en el caso del litio, que se encuentra en los salares bolivianos, la corona de España en el periodo colonial reconoció la titularidad de los pueblos indígenas a los productos que ofrecía el salar. Y hoy lo que tenemos es el absoluto desconocimiento. Lo que ocurre entonces en mi país y en la región es una vieja práctica colonial de los administradores coloniales en el país. Llegaban los decretos del rey, las famosas leyes de Indias, y lo que hacían era llevarse sobre la cabeza esos decretos reales y decían, se acata, pero no se cumple. Entonces hay una brecha entre la legislación internacional e incluso la legislación nacional, la misma constitución política del Estado plurinacional, que son realmente muy buenas. Cuando salieron me dieron ganas de llorar de alegría, pero sin embargo, la práctica es totalmente distinta. Es violación constante y sistemática de esos derechos. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias, don Carlos. Es muy importante para hablar sobre esto. Hay una diferencia sobre la legislación y la implementación de estas leyes. Moving on, I am giving the floor to Les. Just same questions. and from your regional perspective, because we know so much is happening in Australia, in the Pacific region. The floor is yours. You're muted, unless you're muted.
I need that time back. Thanks, Galina, and hello to all the audience who are listening, and I hope that you'll get as much out of this panel as I will. It's great to be with my colleagues, the fellow panelists, who I'm sure I'm going to be giving me lots of interesting information. I wanted to kick off with 1 or 2 minutes, no more, just simply on stressing the fact that the right of Indigenous peoples to self-determination is embedded now in international law. There's no further argument on that sort of issue to be had, even though there might be still some areas that try and avert or whatever, but it's clearly established. And it's actually in the Charter, as we knew when we were negotiating the Declaration. So even if we hadn't sat down and looked for a declaration on the rights of Indigenous peoples, all it took was the discovery that Indigenous peoples exist, and that we exist as peoples, because the right of self-determination is absolute in international law. It's in the treaty, the Charter of the United Nations, and it's in a number of human rights treaties, and we have all these mechanisms now, MREP, the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, Special Rapporteur, and all the special procedures that exist in the Human Rights Council, all affirm the right of self-determination, Indigenous peoples' right of self-determination. And of course, as Professor Mamani just pointed out, that goes on to talk about rights in relation to the resources, that peoples have the right of self-determination, which includes the availability and use of the resources for sustainable existence. Unfortunately, the Rio Declaration confers that all resources belong to the state, and that's absolute in the Convention on Biological Diversity, but it is also correct that the right of self-determination provides the right of permanent sovereignty over resources. So that is a bit of a tangle we have to overcome. Having said all that about international law, because we can say it back to us, just one other point is that when we talk to states collectively, which is in the United Nations, we have their support, right? It is there. But I see it in the Human Rights Council, I see it in the General Assembly every year, and in all other of the bodies of the UN, the subsidiaries to that they support Indigenous people's right to self-determination. It's when we go back to outside of that collective interest that the Treaty of the United Nations has together for peace, harmony, etc. in the world post-World War II. It's when we get outside of that framework that our rights are still being ended by the states particularly, but also by multinational corporations and, of course, the societies, the colonial societies or that have settled in the territories of Indigenous peoples. And we see happening in New Caledonia at the moment, where the Kanaki peoples are fighting not to be a majority vote on their rights and interests, but to fight for their rights to self-determination. Having a referendum in New Caledonia does not sort out self-determination. Having a referendum in Australia does not sort out on changing our constitution, does not sort out the right of self-determination. So our problem is going back in international law. Our rights are protected. We currently don't have status as Indigenous peoples to use any international jurisdiction There may be regional courts, for example, but in terms of we can't go to the International Court of Justice and so on. Only member states of the UN can utilize those sort of resources. So we have to fight in our own local legal jurisdictions under state laws and policies and actions, etc., to see the exercise of our self-determination. So now I'll jump to this situation that we're fighting, which is on the ground with the states and also just as communities dealing with invasive developments on our territories and so on. We have in Australia the Northern Territory Land Rights Act, and I still believe that that is probably the strongest example of rights of Indigenous peoples being embodied in law. But it only applies to the Northern Territory of Australia, which only has a population of about 40,000 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. It's a remote area. It's a high percentage in the territory, but we have 900,000 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in Australia who do not have that same sort of legislative protection. The Northern Territory Act was passed in 1975 on 5 principles of land rights, which are the same principles that we see in the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, Article 25 to 29, and so on, are embodied in there, and is also a great embodiment of the right to prior informed consent, because under the terms of that legislation, mining companies or anybody else, it's not just mining, but the mining industry is probably the best example, cannot assume that mining on Indigenous lands in the territory has the consent of the people. It requires an elaborate process through the land councils to get the consent of the traditional owners. Even the land councils themselves cannot assume the consent of the traditional owners. And for us, with our diversity as peoples, with having 250 different languages, we don't have a hierarchical tribal structure. We don't have chiefs or hereditary leadership and so on. We have basically tiers of authority that everybody is involved in those tiers. So it's not just a ruling class or anything like that. So it's a very complex society with all the different languages. We traditionally we lived in small groups and related that way. We definitely had law, but no law was written. We don't have a written language and so on. So it's very complicated to capture and to embody the structure that our people have, leading to a clear picture of who is the leader or who is the government to go and talk to get the consent of the people in this. And I imagine that's not unlike Indigenous peoples everywhere around, although some areas may be easier to centre where governance is coming from and how it happens, but it's a challenging thing. So I just wanted to make the point that in the Northern Territory, we have a very good example of rights for the Indigenous peoples that are there. It's not perfect, but it is certainly, I think, making a lot of the legislative breakthroughs or legal breakthroughs in Australia, where the Northern Territory Land Rights Act combined with the Native Title Act, which I'll explain slightly in a minute, has been getting wonderful outcomes because it's turning what has been parliamentary made law along with traditional proposals and coming up with them good results. Now, native title itself is what in Australia the rest of us, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, have been settled with as being our land rights. It's not the land rights we want. It's not the land rights we asked for. It's simply saying that the traditional connection we have with our country is recognised in the common law of Australia, which of course is derived from British common law. So it only means that our rights only are able to be seen in law from 1788 onwards, when the colonies were established. And it also means that our connection to that as common law is what we can only be associated with rights over land if we can show a continued connection. And we can show that in a court of law with evidence, a lot of it checked against the recordings made by the colonizers and their notes. And if there's any contradiction, as we saw in the Yorta case, then they immediately say, well, they don't, your oral tradition doesn't account with the written squatters' notes, and therefore you don't have that connection to country. So, and there's another case, the Rose Hill Station case, where when a community were kicked off a station where they had always lived through their generations, and when the Mabo decision was made, the native title decision, they were able to move back on their land, but the court ruled that they had lost their connection over those 30 years. And because they were sending their kids to school and so on, they did not maintain their traditional connection to country. So you can see that the peril that I'm trying to point out here about using common law of the British system for our land rights. It is pretty much in the courts of the white system. It's pretty much based upon the Magna Carta, the way in which laws are interpreted, which, my question to the lawyers were, well, what happened in Australia back in, what was it, 1066 or whenever, when the Magna Carta came about, that changed in Australia? Nothing. The only time Magna Carta ever appeared in Australia was in 1788. Anyway, I'm carrying on a bit. But I just want to say, in terms of the transition to the new energy, the green energy and whatever, this is going to affect us very much in Australia, because Australia is full of mineral resources of all different types, including the example of the lithium mine in Western Australia. But if there's rare minerals to be sought, chances are there's going to be places in Australia where it will be found, and it becomes, a source. So we have been relying extensively on coal and iron ore mining, which has been very, very invasive, very big open cut mines in the eastern and in the western parts of Australia. Uranium mining coming out of the Northern Territory for nuclear use, and so on. So this has all been happening. There's been relationships with the companies worked out based on, not on free, prior, informed consent, but based on right to negotiate or right to consult. The Native Title Act gives us a right to negotiate. If we don't settle something within 3 months, then they can go to the tribunals and get tribunals to give them the rights, which is the way it usually goes. Usually the company doesn't hang around, try very hard for 3 months, and then go straight to the tribunal to get what they want, the right to mine. So, so this new look for the green economy or the green environment is going to recreate that wave again in Australia. But this time around, with the declaration in place, I think with enough of us now motivated to utilise the international law aspects and so on, that this would happen. Sorry, Galina, am I getting the time there?
We will get back to everyone with questions.
Yes, that's right. I'll leave it for the details of the questions to elaborate more on that. So I'll just finish up saying, I think if there's any other point, at the moment, in terms of the right of self-determination, we're looking very much at the treaty bodies. I'm looking at the Human Rights Committee that looks at civil and political rights, at the ISESCA Committee, or both of which have Article 1, both of which have not utilised Article 1 really to examine what states are doing about the rights of Indigenous peoples, but we're trying to build the momentum on that. But again, one of the problems is that international law, under international law, the United Nations will not and cannot get involved in disputes within the state. But there's more than one way. We've done this over decades now to keep that same fight going. Thank you. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you, Les. This was amazing information and really needed, and really to understand that the struggle is really local, right? So even though there are some legal breakthroughs on the local level, on the national levels, it's still not enough. We need to stand together to make sure that self-determination, that free pride from consent, have really become the real tools on the ground. And I'm going to give the word to Dalee. So I know there's also a lot happening in Alaska. It's in the Arctic region. There's Bristol Bay. There's development that was proposed near the village of Ambler. There is a huge polymer mine just north of Juneau, traditional lands of Tlingit people. So Dalee, the floor is yours. If you could provide these just your understanding of the matter and also some regional struggles. Thank you.
Galina, as well as SIRGE overall, and also very grateful to see the brothers and sisters on the panel here. Allow me just to touch upon some recent cases and then offer some commentary about the right of self-determination, knowing that we'll come back to some of these issues further. You're absolutely right, Galina. There are extraordinary pressures across the entire Arctic. Nearly every region and territory of Inuit Nunaat has been inventoried by powerful economic interests. And the national agenda of Arctic Rim states, seen within this broader geostrategic, geopolitical arena, it's extraordinary the amount of pressure that exists within our communities. Many on the call are already aware of conditions for Greenland and rare earth elements. This is a huge debate that kind of falls into or slides into the EU-China relationship, for example. And not to overstate this, but it helps to underscore the extraordinary pressure by forces far from our communities. So I do appreciate, as Les has laid out, the micro, but we also have to be cognizant of the macro level of pressure. For those familiar with rare earth elements in Greenland, let me just point out that the EU and many others, I'm certain, the mining companies in particular, have the EU, its European Commission on Joint Research, have estimated that Greenland holds 25% of the current global rare earth elements. In Alaska, let me simply say that our current state government is considering Senate bill, or no, they've already considered it. It awaits the governor's signature, but Senate Bill 118, an act relating to critical and essential minerals and the global energy transition. It's pretty clear that here again, at the close to the micro level, and for our people in Alaska, that the mapping of critical energy minerals has already taken place, and now we have the state of Alaska, a political subdivision of the U.S., looking at how they can tap into these critical, how can we make them more available and rely upon that to fill the coffers of state government. Never mind any discussion about the rights of Indigenous peoples. Then, of course, we have this layer of, or a plane, I should say, in this political arena of the forces of those Indigenous peoples who support mining largely because of the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act and the corporate structure that came with that particular framework, and those Indigenous peoples who oppose mining. And of course, I could get into the discussion of self-determination and self-government on behalf of these Arctic peoples, but let me just give you this glimpse of the pressure in terms of critical minerals. In Nunavut, we've had legal cases brought related to mining development across. I can't speak for the Sami in full and more familiar with Inuit, but I know for a fact as an Arctic region member of MRIP that for Sami people, the pressure is very much the same. The cases in relation to energy transition, in particular the Fosen case, which actually did invoke Article 27 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, was a subject matter of the Fosen case. And of course, many know on the basis of the protests that were triggered, the case involved 2 windmill farms, and of course the interference with the Sami and their way of life and reindeer herding in particular. I must be honest, and I'm sure Galina is more intimately familiar with conditions in Russia, as well as our colleague Rodian from SIRGE itself. But I think everyone gets the point that across the Arctic, everyone is under pressure, and the current the current discussion that was triggered by the UN Secretary General over the issue has caught the attention of Indigenous peoples globally, and I'll come back to that if we have the opportunity. There are important pieces of information out there, specifically on critical energy minerals and transition. I think the bottom line for me is in this discussion, we're starting to see the powerful forces, but then also we're beginning to feel the challenge, and we've always had this challenge. Nobody wants to really admit it, but we've always had this challenge that our interests don't neatly align with environmental organizations and environmental non-governmental organizations. And the most recent discussion that pisses me off the most is the fact that environmental non-governmental organizations are willing to put the rights of Indigenous peoples on the table as a bargaining chip to gain what they want in terms of their particular agenda. And it's just, to me, seemingly another layer of exploitation and manipulation of agenda. So we have to be really, really careful about who our allies are and who our allies are not, which becomes really, really complicated. But let me just say a few words about the right of self-determination. And the right of self-determination in Article 3 of the UN Declaration has played itself out differently across Inuit Nunaat, and indeed, I believe, for the Sami people. As I said in our preparatory call, I think that what we're seeing at the international level in this debate about the right of self-determination, because it remains a debate, even though Article 3 is explicitly in black and white in the UN Declaration, is that there is much on the table, and that we should have paid as close attention to our rights to lands, territories, and resources as we did to the right of self-determination in the negotiation and finalization of the UN Declaration. Just really quickly, in terms of the right of self-determination, I think it's important to recognize, and I believe everyone probably online does recognize this, that of course all of the rights, and it's the nature of human rights, are interrelated, interdependent, interconnected, and indivisible. And by this, I want to point out that the right to participate in decision-making is a right of self-determination, the exercise of the right of self-determination. Free, prior, and informed consent, which isn't confined solely to those articles that explicitly say free, prior, and informed consent. In relation to lands, in particular, the term control, in common language, we know what control means. That's an expression of the right of self-determination. Article 4 and the so-called internal exercise, I think this is a really important thing to say, and that is those who have argued that somehow Article 4 limits or qualifies Article 3. I wholly disagree with that argument. I think Carlos Mamani has said some important things in regard to self-government and autonomy. If we look at any of the language concerning treaties in the UN Declaration, those speak to the right of self-determination. And that actually brings us back to the fact that lands, territories, and resources are tied to the right of self-determination, which is the prerequisite for the exercise and enjoyment of all other human rights. So we know what hangs on Article 3. Every Indigenous person online knows what the content of the right of self-determination is, but the fact that it's intimately and profoundly and spiritually tied to our lands, territories, and resources is significant. The final thing I want to say about the right of self-determination, and those especially who challenge the legal status of the UN Declaration, because this is a persistent effort. I mean, there are many forces trying to find other ways to diminish the rights of Indigenous peoples. It is highly significant that the International Law Association and Special Rapporteur, starting with James Anaya when he occupied that mandate, as well as scholars across the globe affirming that Article 3 and the right of self-determination is in the neighborhood of and is squarely customary international law. This is huge, and this is significant. Also, Article 4, autonomy and self-government. Again, we're talking about customary international law, another group of rights. And I mean, really think about these things. Our cultural rights and identity as Indigenous peoples, again, in the neighborhood of customary international law. Land rights, many talk about it in terms of property, but we as Indigenous peoples know that we're talking about lands, territories, and resources in the same way that, for example, the International Labor Organization and Convention number 169 acknowledge that when we make this reference, we're talking about the total environment. We're not talking solely about land rights. The other area that is in the neighborhood of customary international law, reparation, redress, and remedies. And if we think about this in all of these rights in the context of critical energy mineral transition, this is big. And when I refer to customary international law, I want to underscore the big fat footnote, which is that this then triggers obligations on the part of UN member states to recognize and respect these rights in the context, the specific cultural context of Indigenous peoples and the distinct rights that date all the way back to that treaty making, that we as Indigenous peoples, as distinct peoples, through our status and our rights and our role in this debate, it's huge. They're significant. And many of the cases that have been brought across the Arctic and those that have been brought elsewhere, customary international law and the rights, the interrelated rights, are it's the peg that we're hanging all of our legal rationale upon. And I think that this, to me, it's crucial to point out that implementation, and Carlos said this, our brother said, that this is one of the key challenges, but we're seeing the expressions at various different levels. And I think that though it took us decades to achieve the declaration, and we're seeing reaction and response through the human rights treaty bodies, through our own efforts in litigation and elsewhere, that we're having an impact. But I am fearful of this current discussion about critical energy mineral transition and the whitewashing and the further diminishment of the rights of Indigenous peoples in this broader context, and of course in the broader context across the Arctic, especially for the tug-of-war that's taking place as far as the geostrategic and geopolitical issues that we have to constantly be mindful of. I don't know if I've said anything useful, but I'll stop there, and then we can get into the other issues.
Dalee, this is very useful, and you are all our jewels of the Indigenous movement, right? So this is why we're here to listen. So thank you so much. This is absolutely critical. Your messages are absolutely critical. And you mentioned the cases in Russia. In 2020, there was a 21,000 tons of diesel spill into the local waterways, decimating Indigenous people's hunting grounds and fishing grounds. And that was done by the largest producer of nickel in Russia, which is used in batteries. You know, nickel is used in batteries. So that's what we're facing globally. The decimation of Indigenous people's lands for the name of this so-called green transition. And we cannot stand still and be quiet about this. We have to deploy all the resources. So we have to deploy all of the means and tools that we have at our disposal to fight this. So I'm going to give the word to Elsa. Elsa, the floor is yours. The same questions for you.
Thank you. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. A great thanks to the organizers, to our moderator, to my co-panelists, and all of you for being here today, because today is really a big anniversary, because we know that 17 years ago, after more than 2 decades of negotiations, on the 13th of September 2007, the UN General Assembly adopted the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And this is a declaration that has political, legal, moral, and symbolic implications. And there were two main interlinked difficulties for states in these years of negotiation. One was the right to self-determination, and the other the right to lands, territories, and resources. And we see that the declaration is imbued with an elaborate legal articulation of human rights that spring out of these two ideas. And the declaration clearly recognizes individual and group rights. And group rights are recognized in various domains, such as the choice of modes of development, governance, education, health, and others. And the declaration aims to outlaw and repair historic and systemic discrimination against Indigenous peoples, in particular discrimination based on their Indigenous origin and identity. And it's clear that the declaration requires new approaches to global issues, such as development, the environment, diversity, pluricultural democracy, and peace. And it encourages the building of genuine partnerships with indigenous peoples. It recognizes, of course, as we are discussing, that indigenous peoples have the right to self-determination, and our previous speakers quoted the main articles. For indigenous peoples, I think our moderator underlined, the right to self-determination has meant many things. Decolonization, survival, well-being. It's the cornerstone of their existence as peoples. States have unfortunately tried to dominate, assimilate, and erase indigenous peoples over time by not recognizing, by subverting, or boldly trying to destroy indigenous governance systems. For a long time, states didn't want to accept that indigenous peoples are peoples under international law, with a sense of their common past and the vision of their common future as groups, and who have had, and they still have, their governance structures, traditional or not, and in any case evolving. For example, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy of the Six Nations created the first confederate constitution in the world. So the discussion on indigenous people's right to self-determination also brings out tensions between states' views and indigenous views on self-determination. It reveals the violence of colonizers' law. One example is the lack of any significant reference to indigenous peoples in the US Constitution and its amendments, except in a clause on commerce, and the lack of any reference to the fact that that country was created on indigenous peoples' lands. This deliberate legal vacuum was there despite the fact that the USA continued concluding treaties with indigenous nations until the beginning of the 20th century. And so being fully cognizant that indigenous peoples are peoples with their own governance structures. The doctrine of discovery that gave colonizing powers from Europe the justification to seize lands not inhabited by Christians is another example. Yet another example of the violence of the law of settler colonialism has been the concept of terra nullius, empty land, that imposes legal invisibility or erasure of indigenous peoples and even as human beings. And other actors, such as corporations, NGOs, religious organizations, and the UN system, and other interstate organizations, still today have difficulties understanding that indigenous peoples have to be dealt with as a self-determining peoples with their own governance structures and not as anonymous peasants, so to speak. And there are guidelines, plans of action, and training efforts to correct this gap. So how is this right to self-determination reflected in the declaration? Because indigenous peoples participated so actively to define it for these 25 years. So in the declaration, there are 9 preambular and 15 operative paragraphs that deal with consent, consultation, partnership, and participation of indigenous peoples in a democracy. And Articles 3 and 4 are central, and they have been read out by our previous speakers. The declaration also states that indigenous peoples have the right to determine their own membership, and self-identification of a group is crucial and has legal, political, and moral significance. That's Article 33. Very tightly linked to self-determination is the right of indigenous peoples to free, prior, and informed consent. And my friends on the panel also have referred to that. It is the strictest standard articulated in the declaration for a number of issues of fundamental significance for indigenous peoples. FPIC, as we call it, is not the same as consultation or participation. Now we come, and I'm very grateful to Dalee, to Les, to Carlos, for mentioning specific examples of exercise of self-determination, indigenous self-determination today. And what we see is that despite these obstacles placed by governments and other entities, indigenous peoples are exercising their right to self-determination, and they have been coming to the international level explaining this eloquently, especially in recent times, and that's very inspiring, actually. And there are examples that have been documented of practices where indigenous people shape their own destinies, from the Inuit and the Sami in the Arctic, the Wampis in Peru, the Ayutla, the Los Libres in Mexico, the Limbu in Nepal, the Laikipia Masai in Kenya, and the indigenous peoples in Sakha in Russia. Examples have been recorded and documented, and we have these, and I can share afterwards, and our hosts can share with you these documents. Is there a right to secession as part of the right to self-determination? Can indigenous nations split off from a state and create their own state? This is an important question, since some states have at times expressed existential fear over the recognition of the right to self-determination for indigenous peoples. Expressions of fear are not always genuine, but seem to aim more at weakening the body of internationally recognized human rights of indigenous peoples. There is no right to unilateral secession in international law as shaped by states. Secession that is accepted as legitimate under international law can take place based on constitutional processes and or by mutual agreement of the parties concerned. However, as we know from basic democratic constitutional principles, the ultimate power lies in the people. If a state violates the trust of the people have the right to revolt. We find this in constitutions. If a state perpetrates gross and systematic violations of human rights, and despite repeated efforts by all concerned, there is no solution but to secede in order to stop the gross and systematic human rights violations, then a territory can secede and seek international recognition and have reason to be recognized. And there are major UN texts that have articulated this conditionality, starting with a historic 1970 Declaration on Friendly Relations and Cooperation among States, which provides the international norms that frame decolonization to the present. And this says, quote, that nothing will be construed as authorizing, encouraging any action which would dismember or impair totally or in part the territorial integrity or political unity of sovereign and independent states. And here comes the conditionality. States conducting themselves in compliance with the principle of equal rights and self-determination of peoples, and possessing a government representing the whole people belonging to the territory, without discrimination as to race, creed, or color, unquote. And this very text was repeated in the 1993 Vienna Declaration and Program of Action, and that was the outcome of the World Conference on Human Rights. And we find it in other texts by treaty bodies. And how did our declaration solve this politically sensitive issue? Among the most heated debates up until the adoption of the declaration was indeed this very point, how absolute the respect of territorial integrity is. So in the summer of 2007, a number of indigenous leaders conceded to act a phrase in the declaration that would refer to territorial integrity, as it would have been impossible to achieve the positive vote of the African group of states without this phrase. So in Article 46, paragraph 1 of the declaration, we see the reaffirmation of this well-established principle of territorial integrity of states. And the struggle of the term peoples, we should say that with the S at the end, was brought in by indigenous peoples as a focus of debate, precisely to underline that indigenous peoples indeed have the right to self-determination. And earlier terms such as populations or people without the S were critiqued by indigenous leaders because those terms implied non-recognition of indigenous peoples as collectivities with their own governance and sociocultural systems. And it took decades for the term peoples to be accepted regarding indigenous peoples. And the adoption of the declaration firmly established the term indigenous peoples as a legal and technical term from the point of view of international law. So the role of free, prior, informed consent, FPIC, in this, it is the right, FPIC, is the right to take part in determining the outcome of decision-making processes impacting indigenous peoples. It's not a mere right to be involved in processes. So FPIC is mentioned in 6 articles of the declaration, in articles 10, 11, 19, 28, 29, and 32. And these cover very fundamental issues for indigenous peoples: relocation, cultural heritage, adoption of legislative and administrative measures, redress regarding lands, territories, and resources, storing hazardous material in indigenous lands, and Galina mentioned, and of course, natural resource exploitation and projects affecting lands, territories, and resources. So these rights contain explicit requirements concerning FPIC on issues of fundamental importance for the rights, survival, and well-being of indigenous peoples. Let us add, and that's interesting for all of us, that various indigenous peoples have been issuing their own protocols on FPIC, both addressed to states and to corporations. And it's very important for all of us to know that. It is clear, therefore, that respect of FPIC is an indicator of respect for indigenous people's rights. And at the same time, various approaches, I have to say this, and guidelines on FPIC have been issued by various actors, and they are not all respectful of genuine FPIC. It's therefore crucial, dear friends, to be aware of and to follow the authoritative interpretations of what constitutes free, prior, informed consent, provided by the indigenous rights related mechanisms that we have at the UN. The Permanent Forum identified FPIC as a major issue at the beginning of its work in 2003 and adopted some first guidelines on the understanding of FPIC in 2004. And the most comprehensive study on FPIC was done in 2018 by the UN Expert Mechanism on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Few final words, because I'm approaching my time. What is self-determined development, which is very linked to energy transition issues, of course, on the agenda today? 3 specific articles of the declaration are fundamentally important in this area. Articles 3, 32, and 37, which I invite you to read because I'm out of time. 2 major methodological questions have been linked to the topic of development: free, prior, and informed consent that we just discussed, and data collection and disaggregation. This second issue is important in order to reveal the inequalities and the real situation of indigenous peoples, inequalities that are often hidden under national averages. At the same time, a question underlined the debate on development, and I will finish with this comment and big question: what does development mean? How do we define it? When it comes to indigenous peoples, who defines it? The concept is often highly suspected by indigenous peoples because of the devastating acts that have impacted their lives in the name of development. And already the UN prefers to speak about well-being, living well, vivir bien, suma causai, la manlaka, in various indigenous languages when it comes to indigenous peoples, instead of the term development. And indigenous peoples have advocated 3 frameworks crucial for their well-being: self-determined sustainable development, human rights-based approach to development, and development with culture and identity. Dear participants and dear friends, as a way of closing this introduction, I would like to pose this question to the non-Indigenous world. When it comes to respecting the rights of Indigenous peoples, will we understand that this is not only about Indigenous peoples, but about humanity and nature as a whole? Thank you.
Thank you, Elsa. This is profound. I want to uplift your note about the data collection and disaggregation. I want to bring a few numbers here, right? So Indigenous peoples, according to the latest data from the International Labour Organization, are 6.7% or 6.2, I think, percent of the population, which is roughly 476.6 million people. I'm sure the data has a little change since 2 years ago, but that's the latest data. The latest study by the University of Queensland notes that 54% of all transition minerals, in some places the percentage is much higher. I think that's 75% in Africa, up to 90% in the United States for some minerals, are on or near Indigenous peoples' lands. And if you compare two sets of data, 6.2% of Indigenous peoples of the global population and 54% of transition minerals globally on average, this is disproportionate impact on Indigenous peoples. And if the governments are going to pursue and go ahead with the plans without our interventions, this is going to cause a lot of, this is basically a question of survival of Indigenous peoples. Are we going to survive this next round or the next industrial revolution, so to speak? I have some questions for you, some follow-up questions. So there was a question in the Q&A in the Q&A section about a specific Indigenous people in India, but the overall question is like, what if the state does not recognize Indigenous peoples? How do they act? Where do they go from there? What if the state does not has not ratified ILO 169? What happens? Where do these people go from here? How do they proceed? Like, let's say, in the context of the green transition. And the other question that has been coming up is like, so what are the tools we have to withstand the challenges that we have today associated with the green transition, right? So we talked about the legal cases that are mounting in different legal regimes. There's just recent case that was in Guatemala when Leonardo Cripa's legal team won a case against the state of Guatemala concerning the nickel mine on Lake Izabal that has existed for a couple of decades, but just was what with huge issues and human rights violations, Indigenous people's rights violations, including killings of Indigenous land defenders. And they made this legal win a reality, right? And it will reverberate throughout the Americas because it was decided on the level of the Inter-American Court, right? So it has legal significance throughout the Americas. And then there are other things that were mentioned, such as the legal breakthroughs. That means actually making FPIC binding in different legal regimes. Like, for example, we worked on the level of the EU on 3 pieces of legislation, the Critical Raw Materials Act, the EU Corporate Sustainability Directive, and the EU Battery Regulation. We managed to insert the language on Indigenous peoples and the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and some of but it was a struggle. It was a huge struggle. I think the reference to FPIC still remains in the CSDDD, but we had to fight really hard, especially pushing against Sweden that has not ratified ILO 169. And, they have a very, a certain stance against Indigenous peoples, Sami people and their territories. That's what it seems on the outset. So, and there are other things like the acts of peaceful resistance, what happened in Panama just last year, in October of last year, when hundreds of thousands of people went out in the streets to protest the mine, the copper mine, the project called Cobre Panama, when the president wanted to revive that project, affecting indigenous people. So it's happening around the world. The wins and gains are happening, but how do we make them systemic? That's the question. Thank you. Les.
Thanks, Galina. Sorry, I might have thrown my hand up a little bit too early, picking up on your first question. I wanted to remake the point. We have got the juridical systems that we need to deal with our rights at the international level. We can't make them enforceable on the state because of this territorial integrity border issue that exists under the Charter of the United Nations. But the first off is in terms of what if the state doesn't recognise Indigenous peoples? The answer is very, very simple, is I would go to the rapporteur on the rights of Indigenous peoples first, because they're there all the time. They can be contacted and they can do an instant response to it. If it starts with a letter to the state by the special rapporteur, and so on. MRIP also has very powerful mandate now it's listed in the way of to assist states to achieve the ends of the declaration, which basically interprets to go, and they can go and do country visits. I don't know that they can do a lot of them, but they've done visits to Australia on the mining issues here. And similarly, the Permanent Forum, when it made its general comment, I think in 2009, basically said that there's a legal connection made between the role of the Permanent Forum in relation to Article 42, which mentions the Permanent Forum's role to see the declaration implemented, and the human rights that are embodied in the treaties and the UDHR, because the declaration is just simply a rewording of the rights that appear in those instruments, right? And it's deliberately, we didn't go out and try and invent a different type of right or something. We relied upon what are the standards, settings and so on that were in this new structure of the UN to bring about world peace and friendly relations and whatever. So I don't think these are utilised enough. I don't think people realise the strength of it. The problem comes back then to dealing with the state. Once you've got to think, in Australia, we've got a whole list of findings, conclusions made by treaty bodies and rapporteurs and all that sort of thing, and the government chooses to ignore them. And that becomes our job for politically campaigning on these issues in Australia. And I think that's the message that MRIP sent to us from 2 years back, might be 3 years back. And that is saying to Indigenous peoples, organise yourselves to achieve the ends of the declaration. So we're pushing the states, and we should continue to do that. But we should also say, well, if we don't have a mechanism, if we don't have a way of, twisting the arm of the states, then we need to get one, and we need to do it. It's big words coming from Australia, from me, because I don't think that we are twisting the arm of government. I won't go into it because I think government has bought out, Indigenous peoples by offering them supposedly powers that they never had, but they're not the powers of the declaration. They are, like the referendum was, to have in the Constitution the fact that the Aboriginal people can advise the Parliament, and they made it quite clear, but Parliament will make decisions, and Aboriginal people will not be able to make those decisions at all. And people thought that this was worth, this whole big campaign that didn't get up, but so the government in Australia is using money, the money that used to be directed to national bodies like ATSIC. You might remember when we had the Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander Commission, it was operating with $1 billion worth of budget with its programs that it could run. And that gave it a big, powerful role because it could use 25% of that money in relation to its own organisation, structures and operations. And that's how ATSIC was able to participate in the declaration drafting and other international exercises. We did a lot of treaty body works around then. So, so go back to summarise the answer. Use those mechanisms there. They are semi-juridical, heading towards juridical. I think the Human Rights Council itself is trending in that way. And I really think that as frustrating as we are, because 2007 the declaration was up, 2014 was the outcome document from the World Conference. Frustrating as it is, it's there and we're not seeing a whole lot of progress from there. The fact is that there is movement, there is foundation going on, and it's a case of we have to be better as Indigenous peoples in order to see at our end that the declaration is heard. For Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people in Australia, most of them don't know the declaration. They'll refer to free, prior, informed consent. They'll even refer to self-determination, but have no understanding of it or how to use and exercise it. They just simply know, they had this sovereign mind, which has always been with us, and they know that what the government is doing is not what they want doing. We just have to educate them better about the declaration. And because in Australia, under our political system, courts cannot make law, right? So none of these rights will be available to us in Australia until the government legislates them, and then we can take matters to courts. But again, I'll go back and I'll mention that we do have the Native Title Act and the Northern Territory Land Rights Act, which is being used very, very well by the legal people who know this stuff to get decisions on land rights, on rights over water, rights over resources, things like that. And it's happening in federal court, in national court. So once it comes out of a Northern Territory case, because they have the Northern Territory Land Rights Act as part of that, it then gets to be part of the national movement of legal works that will help us. So it's a struggle. As I was reminded many times over these decades, it always will be a struggle. It'll never go away. States will always try to be dominant over our interests and our rights, but at the same time we have traction, and we just have to look for strength in the way in which we work. Thank you.
Thank you, Les. Thank you so much. So many good questions are coming in the chat. And Dalee, when you speak, can you also address that question about the environmental organizations that you brought up? Yeah, so Dalee, please.
Okay, thank you. First, I want to quote a young Inuk from Northwest Alaska, Aklasiak Amasak, Adeline Amasak, in relation to the question about what do you do when the government doesn't recognize you. Her quote is, "Be determined to be self-determining." I mean, and that intention. So in addition to what Les has said, in terms of utilizing all the mechanisms, I fully agree with the fact that we have the standards in place. We have lightened the load for the next generation in terms of, okay, you have everything there in terms of the whole recipe. Just use it, mix it up and use it at the local level, local level, at the regional level, at the national level with litigation, whatever it happens to be, and at the international level. This is why I appreciate the activities of the Sami people in Norway, at the protests that were taking place, drawing attention to the impacts that these windmills have been having, combined with litigation, combined with their effort to reach out to the MRIP for a country engagement visit. It's kind of stunning that Norway has this great reputation at the international level, but upon closer inspection, it becomes a little murkier, right? But their approach and the multi-prong approach at all scales, at all levels. So the answer to me is to organize and militate. And by militate, I don't mean this in relation to coloring outside the lines when it comes to protest, but to militate means to bring and be a powerful or conclusive factor in preventing something, right? So I just urge Indigenous peoples who face this peculiar challenge about non-recognition to build on your right of self-determination, which is inherent in your status as Indigenous peoples, and work it up, get it organized. And it's a challenge, absolutely, but you will find support from Indigenous peoples elsewhere around the entire globe. And so Addie's quote, to show up means to really show up, right? The only other quick note I wanted to make in response to this is that we started to get into, and thank you, Elsa, for the presentation that you gave, but we started to get into this issue of territorial integrity. And if we think about it as Indigenous peoples, and we combine it with Les's comment about the fact that the Declaration doesn't create new rights, that it builds upon and provides that specific cultural context for Indigenous peoples. But when it comes to territorial integrity, I fully embrace the point that Elsa made about governments behaving consistent with democratic principles. But if we think about it even further, this was kind of a deal made between states, right? And we're seeing that now. In the majority of the world telling the Russian Federation about their views on Ukraine, right? It's territorial integrity is front and center in terms of that state to state dialogue or conflict. And so I think we have to be mindful that Article 46 in the UN Declaration, in my estimation, doesn't impinge in any way upon our exercise of the right of self-determination. Then if we take a really complex, fascinating case like Greenland and Inuit as a majority on this island and what they face in terms of challenges, we're doing everything consistent with international law. And it's being done peacefully. It's not like the breakup of Yugoslavia, for example, where territorial integrity is again, front and center. I just want to throw that out there. The final thing I'll say is that what Indigenous peoples are going to likely get buried under, I mean like an avalanche, is environmental assessments, right? Everybody's going to start beating the drum at the local level about environmental assessments. That's what's bogging Indigenous peoples down in each of these cases, is that then you have the conflict between those environmental NGOs or environmental organizations and indigenous peoples, where the way of life and the distinct rights that attach because of our distinct identity, this becomes a really thorny issue. And again, if we think that we have made headway, but this is where the declaration, as well as ILO Convention number 169 and the American Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples from the OAS are important, is to figure out and think about the strategy to combat and prevent, again, in the way of militating against something, outcomes that are far from your own objectives. And by the way, even if a country has not ratified ILO Convention number 169, this trilogy of standards still applies to indigenous peoples. ILO Convention 169 enhances the discussion in favorable ways, not in every article, not in every provision, but in favorable ways. The American Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples invokes the UN Declaration and embraces the standards and mirrors many of them, but goes even beyond the UN Declaration in several provisions. So I would suggest that people not draw these lines, but that they look at the interrelated nature of human rights at the international level and invoke what you feel applies in a way that has been interpreted by all others, and namely indigenous peoples themselves. I look forward to the other questions. I hope it didn't take up too much time.
Thank you, Dalee. So we have 23 minutes before the top of the hour, and I just want to ask everyone who is behind the screen, feel free to move around. Sitting in the same spot for 2 hours is a long time, but to take care of yourself, grab a glass of water. We have 22 minutes before, and we still, before the top of the hour, still have a few things that we want to discuss. This is an important topic, and I want to give the word to Carlos. Carlos, do you have, you are on mute and off screen, but would love to invite you to answer some of these questions.
Gracias, Galina. El tema de las herramientas. En este trabajo que estamos haciendo en el llamado Triángulo de Litio, nos hemos dado cuenta que somos un mismo pueblo, separado por fronteras totalmente ideales para nosotros. Es un territorio, es un pueblo, ¿no? Los salares tanto de Atacama como de la parte de las provincias de Catamarca, de Jujuy, de Salta en la Argentina, Atacama era en Chile, y los salares en Bolivia son parte de un mismo territorio, son los mismos pueblos, con una misma cultura, una misma lengua, y el salar en roca en las montañas, en la parte de Puno, en el Perú, igualmente somos un mismo pueblo. Pienso que una herramienta importante para nuestra lucha es el tema de la identidad, ¿no? Y la historia de quiénes hemos sido antes. Hemos sido un pueblo, un estado antes de que lleguen los españoles. Y en esa perspectiva, por ejemplo, los hermanos de la Argentina, especialmente en Salta y Jujuy, han hecho todo un esfuerzo de demostración pública de su protesta que llaman el malón. El malón es una práctica muy antigua, ¿no?, de la lucha de los pueblos indígenas, y entonces ahora están en el tercer malón haciendo protesta pública, cerrando caminos, enfrentando a la policía que trata de sacarlos de los caminos, porque no tenemos otra vía que hacer entender o para hacer entender a los estados que llevar estas manifestaciones. La otra herramienta importante ya lo dijo Dalee, es el tema de que no todos nuestros pueblos, nuestras comunidades conocen de estos derechos. Es importante educar, formar a la dirigencia, al liderazgo. Y por otro lado también, como tenemos estos derechos reconocidos, somos pueblos reconocidos en la Constitución, necesitamos educar a nuestros colonizadores y necesitamos educar a los servidores públicos, porque en algún momento nos hemos dado cuenta que la violación de nuestros derechos no siempre ocurre por la voluntad del funcionario público, sino porque es una costumbre en los colonizadores de ignorar nuestros derechos, ni siquiera de vernos. Entonces, es importante educar a los colonizadores, educar a los servidores públicos en lo que son los derechos de los pueblos indígenas. Pero también es importante el trabajar por una democracia. Nosotros vivimos bajo una democracia formal, pero sin embargo lo que hemos tenido en los últimos años, y es lo más contradictorio, que a nombre de gobierno indígena hemos tenido un régimen totalmente autoritario que desconoce los derechos de los pueblos indígenas. Entonces, una tercera herramienta es el tema de la organización. Organizarnos tanto a nivel local, a nivel nacional y también a nivel regional. Creo que hay varios ejemplos como los pueblos del Círculo Polar Ártico, los pueblos samis que tienen, me parece, un parlamento único a pesar de que estén en Rusia, Suecia, Finlandia y Noruega. Nosotros necesitamos una organización de esa índole. En América del Sur solamente tenemos a la coordinadora indígena de la cuenca amazónica que defiende los derechos de los pueblos indígenas de la Amazonía, pero no tenemos esa misma situación ni a nivel regional de América Latina, como tampoco a nivel de los Andes. Entonces es importante el tema de la organización. Ahora, en cuanto a la relevancia legal, en América Latina, en las Américas tenemos un sistema interamericano de derechos humanos que ha sido bastante efectivo, que son la Comisión Interamericana de Derechos Humanos y como es la Corte Interamericana de Derechos Humanos. Y ya lo mencionaron, el caso de Panamá, lo mencionaste tú, Galina, y creo que ese es un buen camino. Entiendo que varios hermanos que han estado en el foro permanente, y en el caso de James Anaya, que ha sido relator, ¿no? Pues han trabajado en casos de corte para que los territorios y los intereses de los pueblos indígenas sean respetados y sean llevados a caso de corte en el caso de la Corte Interamericana. Entonces, en ese sentido, para mí es bastante importante ahora que el año 2016 se haya aprobado o adoptado la Declaración Americana de los Derechos de los Pueblos Indígenas, y en este año lo que se está haciendo es designar, nombrar una cámara de representantes indígenas, o también dicen un grupo de trabajo que haga seguimiento al cumplimiento de la Declaración Americana. En el país mío, la declaración es absolutamente desconocida, problemas internos entre el gobierno de Bolivia y el secretario general de la OEA, pero estamos haciendo los esfuerzos para difundir esta declaración y tenemos mucha esperanza de que ese grupo de trabajo conformado por miembros de los pueblos indígenas y por miembros de los estados empiece a funcionar. Eso va a ser muy importante porque de hecho la Declaración Americana va a tener, como dicen, un carácter vinculante de cumplimiento obligatorio. Entonces, a nivel interno, lo que nos toca trabajar también es igualmente en la formación de nuestro liderazgo, porque el gobierno es totalmente dedicar los esfuerzos que teníamos antes de capacitación, de educación, de la dirigencia de los pueblos indígenas sobre los derechos que tenemos como pueblos. Entonces, ese es un desafío importante, pese a que nosotros somos reconocidos como pueblos. Gracias.
Muchas gracias, Don Carlos. I really, I can't thank you enough for all of this incredible insight. And before we go to Elsa, I just wanted to say that as Indigenous leaders, as movement, we should not only come to the United Nations and be given 1 or 2 minutes to intervene on the floor. And that's what it's doing to us. The system, that's what the system is doing to us. We put all of our resources in this opportunity to wait all day, to be admitted or not admitted, to speak 1 or 2 minutes on the floor. Instead, we should come up with real solutions, with real tangible solutions on how we can shift this, flip the script. There are other ways, there are market-based ways you can influence, you can find those dots, those little puncture points where you can push and change the narrative. But we have to become smarter, we have to become more strategic and more alert. And our own education is perpetual, not staying on the same page. Every single day, I see the articles released about what's happening globally in terms of the energy transition. This is our duty to educate ourselves and be up to speed so that we can be able to flip that script. Okay, I'm going to give the final word to Elsa, please.
Thank you very much, Galina. I hope I'm not the final word, because this is endless, of course, and beautiful, and it's very inspiring to be together and listen to each other like this. I wanted to make a comment, because you mentioned previously, you said how when you talked about acts of peaceful resistance in Panama and how to make systemic changes, you use this word systemic. So I wanted to say, also following up to your comment just now, Galina, that if we study, if we educate ourselves, as you say, perpetually, and we study the extremely sophisticated and amazing strategies of indigenous peoples and the movement over decades, we will see that indigenous peoples have embroidered, if I can use this word that we, as women, we can use, right? Or woven, right? They have woven amazing methodologies that might have seemed small. So here is my point. The small and slow, that might seem small and slow when you see them for the first time. In fact, they have been systematic at the international level, and they have achieved these openings that we have. In other words, let's study what we can internationally and nationally, locally, and learn from those. That is one comment I want to make. And this is linked also to what Dalee was saying. She says, organize and militate, work it up, get organized. That's what it is. And for me, there is a very, how can I say, hopeful or optimistic word that makes me feel that there is light at the end of the tunnel. Actually, we're not in a tunnel. There is light, because the indigenous movement is one of the strongest social movements in the world. And we can use it. And indigenous peoples have been strategic, and they have used it. And so one of these tools, we have the norms, we have mechanisms, is what Carlos was saying, He said, inform and educate everybody, ourselves, the leadership, but the whole society, the non-indigenous world we address. Because, for example, and that's my final word here, I wanted to say how excited I am to see this effort today of this webinar. And I'm thinking, if we can imagine, you know, not an hour and a half, but we can, on such a topic, which is self-determination, if we can imagine 2 sessions of 2 hours, right? Or 1 session of 3 hours, I don't know, in order to be able to analyze more slowly, for example, case studies that were mentioned. You know, we mentioned them fleetingly because we didn't have enough time, you know, to learn from them. So we need to make this effort, to continue making this effort. And Dalee said, you know, we have created a lot of tools for the next generation. Yes, but also information and education is a major tool. I feel that, you know. So congratulations for bringing us together, organizers. And let's continue this work, okay? Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much, Elsa. I just wanted to let everyone know that there's a global coordinating committee of Indigenous peoples that are currently putting together a summit on just transition that will take place in Geneva, October 8th to 10th. And this is where all these case studies will be reviewed and presented. So every region decided on the delegates list, right? So we'll be hosting the total of perhaps 113 or 15 people in Geneva. And we're on the 3rd day of that summit. So the first 2 days, the modality is that Indigenous peoples discussions only. And then on the 3rd day, we're inviting representatives of UN agencies, other stakeholders, to present the declaration that we will have collectively come up with. So this just one opportunity, but I think we can also organize something during COP29 in Dushanbe. No, it's not Dushanbe, Baku in Azerbaijan. And we also need to organize something during the session of the UN Permanent Forum, because this is a continuing topic, right? This is an important topic that will affect every Indigenous nation. And so that's my proposition as a response to what you said, Elsa. We have 7 minutes before the top of the hour. Any of our speakers, please, if you have any final words to share, Dalee.
Just one point of information. Speaking of the Indigenous specific mandates, the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues and the Expert Mechanism on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples did prepare a contribution to the Secretary General's panel on critical energy transition minerals. And as you might guess, a host of things were addressed, including some very specific recommendations, and whether or not some of these elements have seen the light of day in the Secretary General's outcome document remains to be seen. But I think it's important to watch this space, as it may become kind of the launching point for future initiatives collectively by Indigenous people. So I just wanted to share that information.
Thank you, Dalee. Les?
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to sum up by saying that I think that our battle has shifted to the states per se. I started out saying that collectively at the United Nations, our interests are being supported and will continue to be supported. We're looking for higher status, for example, at the Human Rights Council and the General Assembly. But the states are resisting because of territorial integrity, they think that we're playing on a platform only for states. And they see our self-determination as being trying to muscle them out of some of their position. They don't want to have non-state players confusing the whole thing. So be it. But the outcome document on the World Conference, from the World Conference, talked about, we, the states, commit ourselves to working in cooperation with Indigenous peoples to develop a national plan to achieve the ends of the declaration. And that's the part that I'm trying to focus on. First off, no, we don't use consultation anymore, but everything that has been drafted lately, I notice saying in cooperation with, right? And that's a good word, in cooperation with, because it's a lot more clear than, they can't just say, well, we consulted and this is what we got. But the point being is that the platform is there in that outcome document. Most people don't know about it, but I'm saying it should be published along with the declaration because it is actually the declaration in terms of action, the state's response to the whole thing. But no state is being held to it. Every year at the Permanent Forum, I was asking states, what have you done in relation to paragraph 8 to work cooperatively with the national leadership on a plan of action to achieve the ends of the declaration? And there was nothing. They would just say some words to fill in space, but they had no talk about anything. So, okay, states are not doing it. Why aren't we doing it? Why aren't we saying to the states, we want to sit down and we want to work out the plan of action? And remember, the point that I started with is that the states are wary of us climbing the ladder to be on the same, sitting at the same table or at the same level that they are. That's what they're worried about at the UN, but that's what they're worried about at home too, is that they've always made the decisions about what happens in the country. Indigenous peoples don't have a place in that sort of thing. But the fact is, as peoples, we have right to self-determination. We have the right to determine all those things that are in the declaration, right? So when we talk about, being about the development of youth, the rights of women, etc., these are not for the state to pursue. This is for Indigenous peoples to pursue as peoples collectively. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Let's keep them worried.
Yes. And I just also wanted to mention a quick piece of information that, yes, we had this very fast process of coming up with principles and action items of the UN Secretary General panel on critical minerals. And it was a difficult process because it was basically 5 months. And Sarah Olsvik from ICC and Dario Mejia Montalvo, also from UN Permanent Forum, they represented Indigenous peoples to that panel. And they did an immensely difficult and fabulous job. They fought for every comma. They fought for every single word. And they represented Indigenous peoples on the highest level with the highest integrity. So, but we have what we have today. So that every negotiations, unfortunately, their specificities are forsaken for the sake of universality, so to speak. But please read the statement that SIRGE Coalition has put out just a few days ago. Please do. And I want to assure you that statement was delivered to the email of Antonio Gutierrez, the Secretary General. So with that, I just want to thank everyone again for being here. We heard from our jewels today of the Indigenous peoples in movement, the trailblazers who really worked hard to make the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples a reality. And we're going to be eternally grateful for your work, for your dedication, for everything you have done and keep doing today. Thank you so much, and thank you for everyone who has come today to listen, to learn, to share. And I want to also thank our interpreters and our technical team from Cultural Survival who made this webinar possible. Thank you and have a wonderful day.
Thank you, Galina.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.